I actually had artificial intelligence write that introduction for me. What you guys think? Pretty good?
Fantastic intro.
Yeah, see? Technology. Well, welcome, fellow Toastmasters, especially our guest, Michael. Had your name tag from last time, so you're welcome guest. I went on this journey a while ago, and I wanted to report back how this was. What started off to be a journey creating a podcast turned out to be a mission for myself. There was so much to do, and the reason for the podcast is I wanted to make sure that I had an extension of my sales courses. I teach a corporate sales course for Puzzle, the organization I work for, and every time after those courses, I had a lot of the audience say, hey, listen, are there any more advanced classes? There weren't. How do we stay in contact? Why don't you create a podcast? I said, hey, that'd be a great idea. Until I actually researched it. So I'm going to take you on this journey. It was really a difficult one. I did a lot of research. I had my friend David Neagle here help me out on some things to get the podcast going. But after doing all this research, all this information, the 200 podcasts I watched prior to create this information, gather the research, this is how I felt right here when I was through. Spinning and turning, and I had so much information, and I broke my own rule. I had at least 20 of these bullet points. There must have been 100 I could have put on here, but I usually don't do that, but I just wanted to show you how confused I was. So what I had to do was take a big pause, just deep breath, and find a common thread for podcasting. And what I found out, first of all, was that you have to create a brand. The brand is all about you, your podcast. What do you want them to get out of it? After I created my brand, ran it by some people, did a few showings of it, they told me you need to recreate your brand. All right, you have to recreate this because it's not catching your audience. So what I had to do was come up with something more animated. This is a thumbnail print of it. This actually catches your attention when you go onto the site to see the website, the video itself. So you want something that's animated. Plus, your audience needs to know, what is this about? Well, it's about sales, as you can see. There's also the person's name you're interviewing, and also what the video is going to be about. So you have a thumbnail, look what is there. Maybe I want to watch this. So that's what happens. So once you rebrand, you have to have a podcast background. This is in my studio, the Zoom studio I call it. It's a real wall, but thank goodness for Hobby Lobby. I was able to put this together in about 10 minutes, actually a couple hours to put this all together with the stencil. So now I'm set. I've got the backdrop, thinking about what's going on now. I need to develop my podcast. And I have to have some compelling content. Everybody has to have compelling content, right? It's easy. You have to know your audience. I knew mine was going to be sales-oriented, kind of, sort of. And also, research your guests. And that's important. The guests have got to be really interesting and catch the audience's attention. So, I planned my podcast next. Who was going to be the guest I was going to invite, what the topics were, and where and when we would meet. That's important. Got to schedule that time for slot it out and have your podcast ready to go. So I believe the next thing here is I want to start selecting my guests. So I went in the order of Mo, Larry, and Curly. Okay? I'll show you that in a second. So John was one of my first volunteers to come onto the podcast. He talked about sales being a noble profession. So that was a topic that he wanted to talk about. And it went really well. So thank you, John, for joining the first one. After I did the first podcast, I did a couple more, and I was told, here's where Larry and Curly comes in here, I had Coleman on there. He did a great speech in this club about creating a vision board. You all remember that, right? Some of you do. So I had that on there. So I needed to widen my horizon with my guests and the topics, so that's what I learned. Invite people that are going to be more interesting than just sales. And he had the vision board, so a lot of people enjoyed that video, that podcast. Then I went to assessing or evaluating the skills. So I had to evaluate my skills. That's when I brought in Bob McMahon, who's from this club also, you guys know. And he talked about what the best sellers do differently. It's more of a sales-oriented type podcast. But I was told a couple podcasts before from some audience members that maybe you need to talk less and let your guests speak more, or vice versa. So, yes, you have to hear a lot of comments from people, whether you like it or not. You have to adjust your skill set on the podcast. You guys know Bob. Wind him up, and that guy will talk for an hour straight. My job is over with. I didn't have to worry about it. But I actually did a great job as well. The other thing is that now you have to record your podcast. I'm going to take you back to recording the podcast. So you have your guest lined up. You want to make sure your guest has a lot of energy and is very positive. And everyone you pick, you want to have that energy so people will come back to your podcast. This one here is the actual podcast. So you can see the backdrop to it. And you notice there's a title at the top, the logo of the organization I belong to, and then just a cutaway of what we're talking about there. Next is the hardest part. This is where it gets really, really difficult. Producing and dropping your podcast. Producing a podcast is not that difficult, but to drop it onto a platform. I'll tell you about that in a second. So, of course, you record your video, you're ready to go, it's all done, it's a finished product. What's not a finished product is finished from that stage. Now you have to use some type of audio and video buffers and system applications to make it clearer, visible, and easier to hear for people. So you have to pick which platform you want to use. I happen to use one called Canva. So it takes my raw video and converts it to a finished product. You have to add a few things like your thumbnail, the first picture I showed you, podcast cover, to catch people's attention. So it's a series of adding things to this recording. And then at the very end, now you're ready to go. You need to post it on some type of social media outlet. And I chose YouTube because it was free, easy to work and manipulate. And there's things like Spotify, Stitcher, those are more complicated and you have to pay for some of the uses. YouTube is perfectly free. I do not monetize any of my podcasts just because I wouldn't make any money on it anyways, but because I belong to an organization, I'd have to get permission. So you have to be really careful about those type of laws and so when you do your podcast. Analytics. Everybody I know judges himself. You're going to hear a lot. If you have a podcast, you open yourself up for a lot of critics. Like with Toastmasters, we evaluate each other, we talk nice about each other, we give some recommendations, but you're open game when you're talking about podcasting. You're in the real world now. So to date, since 2022 February, I have 41 podcasts I created. They're all on YouTube. 28 of them were sales content, which I wanted to get sales content out there. Then it took a little turn with some suppliers. Some suppliers saw it and they go, hey, we want to come onto your podcast, talk about our products and services, and we want you to teach your salespeople how to sell our products. What does that sound like? Hey, great, let's do it. So we did about 8 of those. Then I got called from corporate. Everyone get called from corporate. Hey, we want you to do some special content for us. DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion tapes. And I said, okay, this is the road I'm going down I know nothing about. But I had to interview five of our top senior leaders in the organization, C-suite level, CEO, CFO, you name it, they all had a C in front of it. Anyways, after it was all said and done, we had 5 of those videos. We had the biggest hits. We had over 500 views from within the organization on all of them. So it went real well. So there must have been a silver lining somewhere. Summary of what I did was that I took a deep breath and decided, hey, I got to create my brand. I have to develop the podcast. I have to conduct the podcast. I have to produce and drop the podcast to a platform, social media platform. That's basically, from the first slide I showed you to where I had to get to where I was. What I want to do next is come back and talk about the technical information that you need to have, the skills needed to do a podcast. Not anybody really wants to know about that, but they might. Equipment needs, very important. Microphone, camera has to be top notch. And then also the resources that you would use if you ever want to create a podcast. And actually, Toastmasters was a great resource for me, one of the best resources I ever had. My site is BSN, Bunzl Sales Nation. I don't know if I mentioned it at the beginning, I should have, but it's Bunzl Sales Nation. Pat Roach. It's BSN, Pat Roach. Go on YouTube, take a look at it, and give me some feedback. But I'll talk to you guys in about a couple months on the technical stuff. Mr. Toastmaster.